In this session, we'll address the design argument, one aspect of it, one version of it, which is called cosmic fine-tuning. Now, the basic argument is that there are certain features of the universe that could have been radically otherwise, but you have a collection and a convergence of features that make life possible. We will develop this at some length. How does this argument relate to Christianity, the Christian worldview? Christianity very obviously states that the universe is designed by a being outside of the universe, that God has sufficient intelligence and agency, that is will, according to a plan, to design the entire universe. Now, the argument we're giving here in this session is that God has designed the universe at the macro scale. We're thinking about universal principles, scientific laws, constants, and so on. Now, we will eventually get to the idea of specific things in the universe as designed. Obviously, if the whole universe is designed, then everything in it is designed, but you can apply the design argument to particular things such as DNA, molecular machines such as the bacterial flagellum, and so on. Let me read a text that tells us that God is the designer and that the universe was made with us in mind. This is from Isaiah 45:18. For this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens, He is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. There you have the idea of the creation brought forth by God with human beings in mind. Now, the Christian worldview could be summarized, as I said earlier, in three categories or three themes: creation, fall, and redemption. When we consider evidence for design, particularly with respect to molecular machines and living things in general, we don't mean that the design appears to us to be perfect. Now, there may be features of design, let's say in DNA, that we don't understand, but are later found to be elements of design. In fact, that's true. We'll get to that. There really is no junk DNA, as people like Richard Dawkins, in fact, said. But there's another consideration, and that is if humans and the universe are fallen, then we don't expect to see perfection in every aspect of design. The example that I like to use is a car I once owned. It was very reliable, believe it or not, a Gremlin, an AMC Gremlin. It was aptly named for most people. My Gremlin was terrific. It worked very well, but the reputation for Gremlins was that they're not reliable, they tend to break down. Now, you would never say of even the worst Gremlin, the lemon Gremlin, that it wasn't designed. You might say there are design flaws or something has gone wrong, but there is evidence of design given the specificity and complexity of an automobile, in this case, a Gremlin. So one of the biggest objections to the design argument is, well, we don't find perfect design. That may very well be because we haven't noticed design features that are there, or simply because it's a result of the fall. Now, there are other design arguments they don't address in this chapter, and I don't address in the book. That has to do with things like beauty, the argument from beauty. That is, we find natural examples of beauty. We see it and we don't just say that's a collection of chemical and biological, perhaps, and scientific principles. We're struck by the magnificence of a sunset or an ocean scene or a particular animal. There's some fish that are just marvelously decorated with different colors. Now, J.P. Moreland gives a very good version of this argument in his book, The God Question. And perhaps if there is a second edition to my book, I will include that. because it can be very viscerally powerful to people. When you see beauty, intense aesthetic qualities of beauty, it tends to have quite a profound impact on us. But I'm not going to develop that here. Let me talk about principles of design detection. This is applied to both the macroscopic argument as well as the microscopic argument, literally microscopic, when we're addressing things like molecular machines and DNA and RNA, which can only be observed or inferred by the use of high-powered microscopes. How do we detect design? I'm relying quite heavily here on the work of William Dembski, who is one of our most brilliant philosophers of science and philosophers, period, in the evangelical world, and I think in the world, period. So I am openly dependent on his work here because it is so good. Now, in order to detect design, we need something that is contingent, that is, it might not have existed or it might have existed in another form, and it's not something that we would attribute to some impersonal kind of force. It's there, and we have to try to give some explanation why it's there. Secondly, it's complex. And thirdly, it is specific. It matches an independently specifiable pattern. So you have contingency, might not have existed, might have existed in another form. So that really calls out for some kind of an explanation. And it's complex, let's say like a very sophisticated computer as an example, and it's specific in that it has a particular function and it fits a pattern outside of itself. Now that's a bit abstract, so let me give some very direct examples of this that are understandable. Think about finding a letter on the street. It's just being blown by the wind. You would never say that the letter came about through a collection of accidents. You wouldn't say that a piece of paper was blown onto the street and then a pencil was on the street and the pencil was guided by a car that ran over it, and then the pencil formed this, let's say, ontological argument. You wouldn't say, isn't it amazing what wind and pencils and other events can produce? No, you would infer, because this is contingent, this is complex, and it's specified language, that it is designed. Or consider an example we used earlier of a toy. When you see a toy, wherever you observe it, you realize that it's contingent, that it is complex at some level, and moreover, that is specific with respect to having the functions of a toy. And we know other toys. So we're not cherry picking here. It's not like randomly throwing a dart against a barn wall and then putting a circle around it and say, look, I hit the bullseye. That's cheating. You didn't get it, that's cheating. So if there is a bullseye and you throw it and you hit the target, then that's evidence that there was an intelligent agent who was aiming at something. So that's the idea of specificity. Now, let me give you another example of using the what's called the design filter. That is, you want to eliminate natural law explaining something in and of itself and eliminate accidents, or what appears to us as chance. So let's think of Mount Rushmore, where you have the carved images of 4 presidents. You would never look at Mount Rushmore and say this is the result of erosion and wind and animals climbing up and down or insects attacking the mountain. And here we have the specific images of 4 presidents, including Lincoln, who really has probably the most distinctive face of any of our presidents. No, you would say, wait a minute, chance wouldn't account for this. A natural law would not account for this. The combination of chance and natural law would not account for this. Why? Because it is contingent, it is complex, and it's specified. It's not like seeing a face on the moon. It's too complex for that. And it's specified to the actual existence of presidents that we know about outside of the mountain. We've seen photographs or we have seen drawings of these presidents. So when you look at Mount Rushmore, you never knew this perhaps, you are engaging in a design inference. Now, the critics, particularly those influenced by David Hume, the great skeptic, will say, well, this doesn't work for things like the laws and constants of the universe, because when we infer design, it's because we have seen the thing constructed, or we can infer this. So we know that sculptors create sculptures. So when we look at Mount Rushmore, we know that. Well, let's consider another example of something designed, and I call this Mount Jasmore as opposed to Mount Rushmore. Let's say that a very high-powered telescope or some sort of space vehicle discovers on Mars a sculpture that includes John Coltrane, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk. And we know their faces from photographs, from drawings. And you find their faces on Mars. We have no idea how that came about, but we do know that it came about through some intelligent causation, some intelligent agent. Why? Once again, it's complex, it is contingent, and it is specified to the appearance of these four jazz greats. It doesn't matter that we have no idea how it was created. We certainly would say it was not created by any human, but we would still infer design, not because we have seen people design things on Mars, but because of the intrinsic features of the artifact. Now, when you infer design from the universe as a whole or from particular things in the universe, you are not engaging in a form of reasoning called God of the gaps. The God of the gaps idea is that, well, we can't explain something naturalistically. We can't explain it by unintelligent causes and processes. Therefore, we artificially invoke God. Well, that's not really an explanation, the critics say. That is simply calling down a religious idea to rescue a lack of evidence or rescue a lack of good theories. That's not what it is. The design inference is a way to detect design. And if you have detected design, it's a legitimate conclusion to say there is a designer, even though that designer is outside of the natural processes. So it is not the God of the gaps. Moreover, the naturalists often use what could be called the matter of the gaps. That is, if we can't explain something on the basis of material, undirected causes, we simply wait and say, matter will come to the rescue eventually. We will detect a way that a purely material, unguided universe can account for these things. Now that means basically that heads, materialism wins, and tails, design fails. It's not fair. So this is not a God of the gaps situation, it's a design inference. Now let's start to apply this to the fine-tuning of the universe, or cosmic fine-tuning. About in the last 40 to 45 years, scientists have noted that there are many features of the universe in terms of universal laws and constants and principles and so on that have been called anthropic coincidences. This has also been called the anthropic principle. Now this means that physics has discovered certain aspects of the universe that apply to the whole universe that could have been otherwise. There is no natural necessity or no logical necessity. So we can imagine a universe without the fine-tuning of the cosmic constant, or we can imagine a universe slightly different. But what was discovered is that there is a whole constellation of features about the universe that have to be just so, just right. This is sometimes called the Goldilocks principle. To get a universe that is hospitable to life, that has at least one habitable zone. Now, one criticism of this argument, and I'll go into several of these features that have to be fine-tuned for life. One argument given by Bradley Monton is when you appeal to physics, it's just too technical for non-physicists to enter into it. So whatever the force of the anthropic principle, you really can't use it as part of a philosophical argument for the existence of God, because lay people are just not knowledgeable enough to consider the physics. Well, I don't think that's the case. If you consider some of the things that I'll mention and many other things, they're not that esoteric. You can get the basic idea of fine-tuning or the Goldilocks principle through the considerations that I'll give. Now, I don't have film clips, but I highly recommend the DVD called The Case for a Creator on this fine-tuning argument, and also for the cosmological argument. Now, let's consider what Martin Rees, who is an atheist scientist, calls just 6 numbers. Sir Martin Rees has been very impressed and argues that the mathematics required for human life is highly improbable, but it has occurred. So you have an improbable event and a specified event, and an event that is very complex. Actually, it's not just an event, it's the total of the universe. Now, let me give you these 6 features. The strength of the force that binds atomic nuclei together and determines how all atoms are made, finely tuned. Could have been otherwise. 2, the strength of the forces that hold atoms together divided by the force of gravity between them. 3, the density of material in the universe, including galaxies, diffuse gas, and dark matter. 4, the strength of a previously unsuspected force, a kind of cosmic anti-gravity that controls the expansion of the universe. 5, the amplitude of complex irregularities or ripples in the expanding universe that seed the growth of such structures as planets and galaxies. 6, the 3 spatial dimensions in our universe. Life could not exist if it were 2 or 4, Rees says. So these are not things that have to be the way they are. They're not logically necessary, like the law of non-contradiction or the law of excluded middle. But they are what they are, could have been otherwise, and you consider the specificity. You have tremendous complexity, you have contingency, and the specificity is life, or more specifically, human life. So you're not cherry picking in this case. Now, there's something else that's quite remarkable called the cosmological constant. And I'm going to read a little bit about this. You see this on page 252 of my book. This is some material from Robin Collins. Collins is particularly impressed with the value of the cosmological constant. He believes that the inference to design from fine-tuning can rest on the value of this factor alone if it cannot be explained naturalistically. The cosmological constant is the part of Einstein's equation of general relativity that deals with the expansion rate of the universe. Physicist Steven Weinberg, an atheist, notes that the cosmological constant does seem remarkably well adjusted in our favor. Although it could have had any value, first principles suggest it would have to be very large, either positive or negative. In fact, had this been so, life would not have been possible. Collins states that if the cosmological constant were not fine-tuned to within an extremely narrow range, 1 part in 10 to the 53rd, or even 10 parts to the 120th of its theoretically possible range of values, the universe would expand so rapidly that all matter would quickly disperse, and thus galaxies, stars, and even small aggregates of matter could never form. That's a bit technical, but it's well received in the world of physics, and the cosmological constant could have been constantly something else, and if it were something else, we would not have life. So this is more evidence for anthropic coincidences. Now, let me deal with some objections to this argument. I think they can all be met very handily. The idea is, well, it's just a truism. Of course, if life exists, the necessary and sufficient conditions for life had to exist to bring about life. It's a truism. So you don't need an explanation for that at all. Well, this confuses two things: the truism and the question, why did these necessary and sufficient conditions obtain to bring us about, when they are so vastly improbable and complex and specified for human life? It is amazing how often the truism objection is given when it's based on a profound confusion. Now, there's another objection to this, which claims that the odds of all these factors coming together, the laws, the constants, the proportions, the odds are inscrutable. How do we know what the probability would be? Well, you have various considerations of probability and improbability, and they're well established in the scientific world. And I think this inscrutable odds objection really fails. If it was just one thing, let's say, and we really don't know what the probability of it is, that would be perhaps a problem. But actually, maybe not, because you have the cosmological constant. But we have so many things that are antecedently improbable that I don't think this argument works, the inscrutable odds objection. Or you have the chance one universe objection. Well, this is the universe that just happened to come into being. It was tremendously improbable, but here we are. Well, that's not going to work if there is a better explanation. Well, if there is an explanation at all, because if you say it's chance, that leaves out explanation in principle. And it's also really denying the principle of sufficient reason that we discussed earlier. Now, here's one that's a little trickier. It's called the multiverse theory. The motive for the multiverse theory is if we don't expand the probabilistic resources, then we have to infer a designer outside the universe who fine-tuned it for life. Well, we can't have that, so let's multiply universes. Let's consider many, many, perhaps an infinite number of universes. If so, we could be the lucky universe. We could be the universe where life exists. Now, there are actually two versions of this, the many-universe multiverse theory and the multi-domain universe theory. This is not to be confused with Hugh Everett's many-world interpretation of quantum physics. But let me give you a general critique of the multiverse theory, and that is it's ad hoc. And worldviews should not be ad hoc. That's one of the principles that I gave in Chapter 3, one of the criteria for assessing worldviews. So instead of the simpler explanation, which is all these features are fine-tuned, they're all antecedently very improbable, we can calculate the probabilities, many physicists have done so. Instead of saying there's a designer, which is the design inference, which follows naturally, which doesn't beg any principles and defines or describes what's there, let's multiply universes. Now, these are not possible worlds in modal logic. These are supposedly actual universes outside of our universe. That will solve it. Do you see how artificial and ad hoc that is? It's what Bill Dembski calls a bloated ontology. That is, in order to preserve philosophical materialism or naturalism, you have to multiply all kinds of universes in order to expand the possibilities. Basically, you get more throws of the dice to come up with a hospitable or habitable universe. That is very strange, especially when you're talking about scientists who want to explain things clearly, crisply, and simply. All right? So this is really the main objection to this view. It is very ad hoc and it is unsubstantiated. In fact, one version of this view says we could never verify the existence of these other universes. There would be no possible evidence for them. My goodness, that sounds like a leap of faith to believe in something like that, atheist faith. Now, there's another version that says we might have evidence for other universes, but we don't have it yet. One says no possible evidence. That's a leap of faith into the atheistic void. The other says there might be some evidence, but we haven't found it yet. Well, that's what I call the post-dated check fallacy. Or give me more time and we'll find it. It's another case of the matter of the gaps. Instead of a simpler, more clear explanation of one designer, that's simple, that accounts for the data. We get to it from the design inference, and inference we use in all kinds of other areas of life, like archaeology and forensic evidence in courts of law. You multiply universes which could not be detected, or you say, well, we might have some evidence for it down the road if the theory is correct. Now, this is very weak theorizing, extremely weak. Now, if this macroscopic argument from design, based on fine-tuning, works, what are the results for the Christian worldview? First, it tells us that there is one designer who has the intelligence and wherewithal to design the entire universe. This sounds suspiciously like the God of the Bible. So that rules out atheism. It rules out agnosticism as well, because it's a profound and powerful argument. Furthermore, it eliminates pantheism, the idea that God and the universe are one. All right? But you need a designer to explain the designed. You need a creator and a creation, something that pantheism denies. So when we combine the cosmological and ontological arguments along with the design argument, here are the conclusions. We have a first singular cause, we have a personal being, we have an immaterial being, a timeless, spaceless being, an all-powerful being, a conscious, intelligent being, and a transcendent being. Those are profound implications. And we have more natural theology to do.